So my name is Father Daryl Winkler, but I see Norita Fleming there on my screen. I don't know if you can see me or not.
Yes.
Welcome to everyone for joining us today on this beautiful fall day for another session of our in our series called Conversations for Our Times. We started this session actually as a 60th anniversary of our parish. We were going to have a lecture series, but then the pandemic happened and we weren't able to fulfill that. But instead, we started this Zoom series, and it's been, I think, better than the lectures that we had planned. The point was that we want to, as a parish, be aware of the signs of the times, which was probably one of the most exacting challenges from the Second Vatican Council to the Church. It was a call to reflect deeply on the events unfolding before our eyes and to respond to them in a mature, committed way. So that's why we have called it Conversations for Our Times. So I'd like to begin with a statement of welcome and a land acknowledgement. At St. Basil's Parish, we regard the love of God to be the foundation of all life and ministry. We believe in the ever-present love of God as witnessed through Christ and empowered by the Holy Spirit. We believe that each person is loved by God and is of sacred worth. Therefore, through God's grace, we welcome all persons to our parish and to our series. We express God's hospitality by creating a safe and healing, accessible, and transforming place for all to enter. And we'd also like to acknowledge that St. Basil's Parish is located on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin First Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and we uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. So I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Burns now.
Thank you, Father Winkler. So our guest today, Dr. Carol Kuzmochka, wants this to be as much of a conversation as we can possibly make it. So that being said, typically at this point, I would say, well, we're going to have a question and answer period following the presentation. That's not the way we're going to proceed. So in order to encourage your participation, I'm going to ask you to think about clicking on that little box at the bottom of your screen called Reactions. And then if you click on that, it gives you a menu of little icons, and there's a bar that goes right across the bottom that says Raise Hand. So if you click on that, we can see who, and certainly Dr. Kuzmochka can see who wants to talk next, and she will be guiding the entry into the conversation according to the order in which you raise your hands. So please use that technique in order that we can facilitate the conversation as we go along. And at some point in the afternoon, we're probably going to be divided off into what's called a breakout room where we have a little chat. And the good news about breakout rooms is that can't be recorded, so you can really say what you want there. But that aside, when you do raise your hand, once you've spoken, you actually need to open the reaction box again to click off, and it says lower hand, and that way we know that you've done your bit and you're not still waiting. So that's the technical note for today's session. It's my opportunity now to introduce Carmel Horan, from our colleague here at St. Basil's, longtime member of St. Basil's community, who will formally introduce our guest this afternoon. Carmel.
Thank you. I'm very happy to introduce our presenter, Dr. Carol Kuzmochka, for today's session of Conversations for Our Times. Dr. Carol is presently the director and lead researcher for the Center for Religious Education and Catechesis. She's also a part-time professor at St. Paul University and director of faith formation at the Archdiocese of Ottawa, Cornwall. Carol began her career with a Bachelor of Arts degree from Dalhousie University in Halifax, followed by a Doctor of Ministry degree from St. Paul University here in Ottawa, where she continues a long and highly respected career. Since 2018, Carol has been the lead researcher for an action research project in adult faith education in Canada, exploring the gap between faith and life and searching for practices in adult faith education that bridge them. In this interactive webinar, she will share the wisdom that is arising in this qualitative research and invite participants to discussion and reflection about the practical implications and their relevance for a synodal church. You can check out much more about Carol's research and accomplishments from the St. Paul University website. I'm very pleased to introduce Carol, having met her at St. Paul University and also at the Archdiocese. Her topic today is bridging the gap between faith and life. It is my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Carol Kuzmochka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmel. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here on our videos, and some people with whom I go back a long way, Ann Taylor and Timmins and Christine, who's been so involved in our research, and Jean Goulet from so many different locations over the years. And of course, you, Carmel, as you've indicated, and Father Daryl, he and I have been walking shoulder to shoulder in all sorts of ways. So anyway, it's wonderful to be with you and to be invited into these conversations for our time. And as Kevin has kindly indicated, we'd like to make this as conversational as we can, given that we're here online and have lots of opportunity for what I hope will be some meaningful interaction with one another. Carmel, thank you for that introduction. I just want to say that being Director of Adult Faith Education for the Archdiocese of Ottawa is a treasured memory from my past. I haven't been in that role for some time, though. That was in the early 2000s, a wonderful time that I shared La Victoire with you and many others as we journeyed in faith together over those years. So my full-time work now is at St. Paul University, and this research project is very much at the center of that work. So we know that many of the people, many of you who are here are obviously connected with St. Basil's Parish, perhaps your parishioners, but are there other people here who are not parishioners at St. Basil's Parish? Just wondering who we are gathering here today. Okay, we see a few hands going up. Would you be so kind as to unmute and tell us where you're from and what brings you here?
Okay, I guess I'll start. My name is Lise Babin, and I live in Thornhill, Ontario, just north of Toronto. And I lead a meditation group on Saturday mornings. That's with the WCCM. I don't know if you're familiar with WCCM, World Christian Meditation Community. And Norita has joined us several months ago. And so I shared a talk that was given through WCCM just recently, and then she mentioned your talk. So that's how I'm here.
Oh, great. Welcome, Lise. Thanks for telling us. Christine, please.
Yes, Christine Taylor, Diocese of Prince Albert. So northern Saskatchewan, middle of actually central Saskatchewan. Everyone else thinks we're the center, but we're actually really in the geographical center of the province. I'm the Director of Evangelization and Catechesis for the diocese and have been journeying with Carol a little bit on her studying and research. So quite interested to hear how this unfolds.
Thank you. Good to have you here, Christine. Anyone else from another location other than St. Basil's Parish?
Yes, I would like to say I'm a sister of the Congregation of Notre Dame, and I live in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And I was kind of connected to these sessions by a friend of mine, but Kathy Kelly. So I like to follow these talks whenever they come around.
Thank you, Eleanor. Good to have you with us. and anyone else who's from another location outside of St. Basil's Parish.
I'm
Yes,
Mary
please.
Wright. I come from Bell's Corners United Church, and we have a religious intellectual group called the Seekers, which study texts, and people come from a number of different churches to have the discussions. It's very good. So I'm interested in these kinds of topics.
Okay. Thank you, Mary, and welcome. So great to have, of course, be here. Oh, Anne, please.
I just want to say, nice to see you, Carol. I remember well our Timmins days, but I'm in Pembroke now, Ray sister, and but I've been connected with it. Never lived in St. Basil's Parish, but I've been connected with it through family, the Mahonys and the Taylors, all my the whole life of the parish.
Well, great to have you here, Anne, and it's always wonderful to set eyes on you.
Thanks.
As I said, we share a long past together.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to use this opportunity as we enter into this interactive webinar to underscore a really key finding that is coming up in our research. And I can't think of a better context in which to do it than being here on this screen, gathered as a community, really a community of learners, I would dare to say. And we're learning in our processes, in our findings, that having a community of practice is absolutely essential for being able to find our way forward in bridging that faith-life gap in how we're leading and practicing as church. So in other words, that's a way of saying, I think, what probably is kind of obvious. We really need to share the wisdom if we're going to find our way forward together. And we've discovered that time and time again as we've gathered as research groups. I know Christine and Daryl could both attest to this. How important, how we realized here, I think, is a wonderful way of expressing the essential role that that community of practice plays. We realized quite early on that we were coming to new, let's dare to say, wise, practical insights about how to be effective that none of us could ever have come to on their own. It was in the process of sitting and reflecting and grappling together that we were able to lift up new perspectives and insights for practice. So I want to say that right out of the gates, because I think it's so important. What we're finding is that it's so important if we're really looking for ways to become more effective in our practice, then it's not something we ever take on alone. And I think we're well positioned in this call of Pope Francis to be a synodal church. I think community of practice, sharing the wisdom, walking together in the challenges is very much characteristic of that synodal church. So I have a few things I'd like to share with you. You'll see them on these slides. And I'd also really like to be able to take some time for your responses and insights and questions, points of view that you would like to bring up along the way. So I'm going to give you a good taste. And I realized, I have to tell you, I realized when I was trying to bring some kind of comprehensive summary of our work to you in this hour and a half, I realized I was going to fall sorrowfully short, that the work we're doing has become more and more complex. So I'm hoping that what I can do is give you a good taste of some of the kernels, the heart of the matter insights that are arising in our research that I hope will be enriching for all of us. So a bit of context, just to really place what I'm doing and what I'm bringing to you to share with you today. So as Carmel mentioned, since 2018, I've been leading what's called an awareness-based action research project through the Center for Religious Education and Catechesis at St. Paul University. Now, action research is well known, and some of you may already be familiar with it, is well known as a way to generate good, wise, practical solutions to problems. So we certainly think that that's exactly what we need, is some kind of framework that supports us in trying to come to generative, practical solutions to problems that we're experiencing. So what is this problem that we're studying exactly? Well, the gap between faith and life and how to bridge it. In a succinct manner, that is what we're studying, the gap between faith and life and how to bridge it. Now, our particular focus of that gap between faith and life and that question, how do we bridge it, is to discover practice in adult religious education or catechesis that bridges this gap. So in other words, we're looking for transforming practices, meaning the results are impactful, they're effective, they're relevant for people. And we're doing there are two things involved in this. The first is that we need to respond to the intense and universal human hunger to find meaning in life. That's one way that practices are transformative, is they respond to that intense and universal human hunger to find meaning in life. Sometimes this human hunger that we all share is referred to as a sign that we're hardwired for God. Indeed, Saint Augustine echoes this when he says, "My heart will only rest when it rests in you, O God." We're seeking God, we're seeking that, we have that hunger to find meaning in life, which only ultimately is satisfied when we discover our relationship with God. And then the second thing that characterizes transforming practices is that they respond to the need for mature Christian disciples who can engage, who have the capacity to engage in the church's mission, to partner with God in the healing of the world. I find this idea, and we can credit it to several theologians. One of them central to this work is Richard Niebuhr, who really describe our relationship in this world with God as one of partnership, and also often as a creative partnership, where we together with God are engaging in healing the world, bringing the good news to the world. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't note here that James Fowler is the trailblazer who brought both developmental psychology together with faith development in the 1980s. Many of you may be familiar with his work, but that brilliant work, and it was foundational work that has been built on over and over, continues to be built on. He's the one who opened the door to understanding that faith is both. It is both that human quest for you, that universal human quest for meaning, and faith is about how we live and engage in partnership with God in the world to heal the world. Now, key in here, and it really, I think, holds an important key to, again, the kind of practice we're searching for. Fowler has demonstrated in his work how human maturity and faith maturity are inextricable. Now, this is a really important piece, and I want to underscore it in a big way as I present to you this project, because the capacity to respond to the kind of discipleship that Jesus invites us to, or that Pope Francis is now in our current time echoing for us, requires a level of human maturity that we need to face in, I think, a kind of painful way, doesn't always exist among the human population. And what do I mean by that? Fowler was able to show us that the capacity that our circle of who matters expands and gets larger as we grow and develop as human beings. And in stage theory, it's between stage 3 and stage 4 that human capacity, that maturity, begins to open to really caring about the other, deeply caring about the other, beyond our own circle, beyond our own needs. Now, further to that, further to that, it's not until stage 5 or between stage 4 and stage 5 in our human development that we're able to do things like hold the tensions of difference or paradox, to hold a paradox and not need to collapse it into an either or. In other words, to move beyond polarizations or dichotomies. So it's a human capacity to be able to hold the tensions of paradox that comes not until, as human beings, we've developed until about a stage 4 or stage 5 of development. And here's the clincher in all of this. Wonderful work that's been done. One key researcher is Suzanne Cook-Gruter, is able to demonstrate that on average, about 15% really of the population ever reaches those levels of maturity. Now, that's essential for us to realize, and as a church for us to take responsibility for, because what it really boils down to is that we put before us an agenda for a kind of discipleship that most of us do not have the capacity to respond to. And I think it's really important for us to realize 2 things. First of all, the church has a responsibility to provide the kind of learning and growing spaces for all of us as adults that help us foster that maturity. It's essential. And then the second thing that's really important for us to realize about that is that we cannot separate our activities in faith education, evangelization, engaging the mission of the church without realizing that that capacity as human beings is necessary for us to be able to engage in what we're being called to. And I say that in this particular way because I think we all need to hold close to our hearts, and close to our practice, a very keen awareness that these are the kinds of learning and growing spaces for adults that help engage that deep hunger for meaning and help us mature as human beings, which are also mature disciples, which opens the path forward for us as adult Christians and mature believers. I think the importance of this comes clearer too when I simply say the capacity to disagree with someone without making them an enemy doesn't come until we're well along the way of human development, stage 4, stage 5. So when we simply stop to consider the great polarizations of our time, we have to realize that one key dimension of those polarizations is that as human beings, a human community, we do not have the capacity to disagree, to hold different perspectives from others without making enemies out of the one who is different from ourselves. So that's a pretty serious consideration when we look at the kind of practice we need to engage in to bridge the faith-life gap. So I'd also like to say, I know when I say our work is in adult religious education or catechesis, sometimes people think, well, what does that have to do with everything else? And it's a good question. So I want to, right from the start of what I'm sharing with you, just to underscore the fact that the search for adult religious education or catechesis practice that bridges the gap has implications for all practice in the church in 2 ways. First, we might not realize, or perhaps some of you are already aware, but for those of us who are not, from the earliest days, catechesis was the term the church chose to describe all of its activity to form disciples. You can find that in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 4. So we've chosen very intentionally in our research to hold this wide view that when we talk about catechesis in its broadest sense, that we're talking about all of the activity in the church that helps to form disciples. The second way this research in adult religious education and catechesis has implications for all of the practice of the church is that adult catechesis, we're discovering more and more, points to the need to draw on transformative education. Now, transformative education is exactly the place in the educational milieu that focuses on helping us grow and shift perspectives that help us mature as both human beings, and in our context, also as mature disciples. So adult catechesis points to this need to draw on transformative education that holds wisdom for all of the ways we need to accompany others in their faith life. That whole way to meet people in such a way to open learning, growing spaces where we can increase our capacities, be transformed in our faith and life. One of the things that I'm becoming more and more convinced of, and I've been working on this for a while and trying to find some meaningful places, to discuss this, to present and discuss this, is that I'm really convinced that adult catechesis needs reclaiming to understand its potential as part of healing that faith life gap. And here's why I'm saying that, and this is just very brief, and I hope it's not too much for you, but just to give you a context for that. Catechesis, the term, comes from the biblical word katekeo, which means to echo or resound. And it only existed in verb form with all the words for teaching that are used in the New Testament over 200 times. Katekeo is a very unique word. It only appears 7 times. It is not a synonym for teaching. And it appears 7 times, and there are the places that it appears. And what we can see about the word is that, well, first of all, it only occurs in verb form in the New Testament. There's no noun for katekeo. And it holds a special meaning that is deeply relational, because what it holds together in its meaning is that the good news that's being shared by someone is being deeply received in an impactful, life-changing way by the recipient. So in other words, something life-changing is going on. When one person is sharing this good news with another, something life-changing is going on in their relationship. And it's characterized by that integration into their lives, changes how they live. The best parallel that we can think of in our current time and place is what transformative education describes. And this is why I think, one of the reasons why, the measuring stick in transformative education that allows us to say that something has been learned, really learned in that whole sense of learning, in the whole person, is that the concrete effects can be seen in how someone lives. So you see, it would never be enough in catechesis for someone to have an intellectual precept or to be able to name a teaching without being able to see how that's embodied and integrated into how a person lives. So as a result of what we're finding in our research, we're becoming more and more convinced about the importance of clearly identifying the need for adult religious education or catechesis to intentionally draw on transformative education. And we need the opportunities for our leaders in adult faith education and catechesis to learn these methods of education. So, and here again is another, I think, very important expression of how this authentic catechesis is what I'm or reclaiming of catechesis is essential. Transformative education is about meeting people where they are. And about relationship and accompaniment that is centered on the learner and how he, she, they make meaning. And our research findings, and Daryl and Christine could help me express this in no uncertain terms. Our research findings are pointing again and again to the fact that effective adult faith education or catechesis meets people where they are. And it is fundamentally relational and about accompaniment rather than about transmitting information or ideas from one person to another. So again, this insight has been at the heart of our findings about what it means to bridge that faith-life gap. Now, how are we studying this? I just want to present that very briefly to you, and without getting too weighted down by all of the terminology, but just to give you or the methods, but just to give you a sense of how we're going at this. So we're using something I mentioned earlier called awareness-based action research. And this uses a particular theory U listening or generative conversation model as the way of moving us through our spiral. You see how any practical method like this that leads to transformative practice, so any action research methodology, is most about studying what we're doing as we're doing it. That's what makes action research meaningful. And it involves using observation. So we observe our real context, then we reflect on it, we plan according to our reflection, and then we act on what we've planned. And once we've acted, we start observing again. How did that go? What's new? What are we learning? Where are we feeling we need to make adjustments, or where are new insights emerging? So once that acting is in place, then we come back and start the observing, reflecting, planning, acting again. And you see how that moves through a spiral. And you'll recognize right away, I know there's a lot of educators in this session. We've learned, haven't we, that any meaningful learning and growing takes place in a spiral form, doesn't it? Where we move forward, coming back, moving forward, coming back, moving forward. So spirals are a wonderful symbol for any learning and growing in any domain, whether it be education, research, or elsewhere. Theory U is a particular methodology that can, a particular method that can be used for action research, where we intentionally open our minds, hearts, and wills to what we're observing, to what we're reflecting on, to what we're planning and acting. And I won't go too much further with that, except to say that what it's helped us realize is that listening is the key. And I know no one is surprised when I say that, but that listening is the key for us, both to learn the new practice, to gain the insight we need, and listening is the key to adult faith education, catechesis, to accompanying and being relational one with the other. Now, we were overjoyed. We started this work in 2018. Imagine how pleased we were when Francis started talking to the whole church about our need to walk together and to listen. We were feeling that the work we were doing was coming into wonderful alignment with the call that Francis was sharing with us, beckoning us to answer. Now, focus groups are known in qualitative research. They are known for being the very best place to generate that kind of practical wisdom that we were speaking about is so necessary to be able to do this work. So they're kind of the nucleus of the community of practice in action research that powers us forward in that observing, reflecting, planning, acting process. And when this was our phase 1 focus group. I know some of you will recognize faces there for sure. And our focus group consisted of respected, recognized leaders in the field across the country. We were attempting to represent East, West, Central, and to call upon the community to help us identify the leaders who could really help enrich our wisdom. And each person in the focus group was well networked with others. So they weren't only bringing their own voice, as valuable as that is, of course, but they were also regularly consulting with people in their networks. Most of them are in large, well-developed networks of practitioners, and they were consulting there to gain wisdom about bridging the gap, about effective practice to bring to our table. So we've had 3 focus groups now, and I'm just flashing some pictures so you can get an idea of the wonderful people with whom we have journeyed. You see Father Daryl there, I'm sure. And this is our most recent focus group that have just wound down about a month and a half ago. We also intentionally engaged semi-structured interviews. You may know some faces in these lovely groups as well. And semi-structured interviews allowed us to move beyond only our focus groups, which were relatively small, although, as I've mentioned, these groups were parts of networks with whom they were also consulting. So lots of voices coming to our conversations, to our table. And it really allowed us to do something that we were calling expanding our wisdom by including lots of voices from the field. And we noticed that as a focus group, when we were moving over the months together and engaging in that action research, that careful generative listening, that findings would start to come to the surface that we wanted to test a little further with other practitioners as well to see what they could bring to the conversation. Now, what's this gap too? So that's the how of the awareness-based action research that we've been doing about bridging the faith-life gap, about effective adult faith education that meets those 2 purposes, that great universal human need for meaning making, and that empowers mature Christian disciples. And so what's this gap we're speaking of? Well, it was first defined in the Vatican Council document, Gaudium et Spes. Many of you, of course, know that document well. And the disconnect between faith and life was described as one that deserves to be considered as one of the most pressing problems of our time. That's how Gaudium et Spes defined this gap or disconnect. We've noticed, and perhaps you have too, how this has continued and perhaps increased this gap. And religious educators have said, and I'm quoting Myrtle Power and John Vandenhagel here. Many of you will know those people. Religious educators have said, and I think they speak well for all of us. Tom Groom also has echoed this. There has never been a more difficult time than ours to educate in faith and life. So there are strong feelings that this gap, this divide, this disconnect is more difficult to manage now than it ever has been. Now, Gaudium et Spes saw 2 reasons for this divide or gap. And one it described as atheism, which was really just rising in the 1960s as a kind of social phenomenon. And then all of the other characteristics of secularity that were coming with that, stronger all the time, consumerism, materialism, individualism, etc. I think we're familiar with all of those challenges. It also, though, and this is more subtle, though, I found I had to really dig through the document to see this message. It also saw that there was a failure of the church to engage meaningfully or effectively in a way that connects with people and their lives in meaningful ways. So it was good to see that it wasn't all the looking out to find the problem, but also the looking in was happening as well, where it's not only out there, and it is indeed, I mean, who would ever underestimate the challenges of all of these things, these social realities and cultural realities. However, it also did have an inward look saying, you know, we're not always the best witnesses. We're not always the ones who are really meeting people effectively where they are. So we have those 2 lenses applied at the Second Vatican Council. And we picked up on that in our time in phase 1. of our research in particular, we started to be able to define, at least for our group, and maybe these will resonate with you more clearly, some of the reasons for that disconnect. And we realized one phenomenon that was clearly named, a kind of compartmentalization, where it seems that sometimes we're able to be in the gathered assembly of faith, the Sunday worshiping community, for example, and leave there without feeling like we have to take anything from that into the rest of our lives. So there's a real disconnect, right? A compartmentalization where I can go on Sunday and live something that somehow doesn't translate, doesn't connect into the rest of life. It's very interesting to notice recent research from Angus Reid is pointing to the fact that there are very often people in the Sunday communities who don't actually believe the key core teachings of the Christian community. And so we can ask, well, why would they want to come there? And I suppose those answers could be complex. But often I think there's a cultural dimension, or it's a family practice, or there can be many reasons, but it's important for us to know that the fact that someone comes on Sunday does not necessarily mean that they're that integrated person living their faith and life with integrity. So that's an important realization, because we always have tended to kind of generalize that if someone's there, then those are the ones who are engaged in the mission of the church. It might not always be the case. So compartmentalization can go in both directions, the people who are inside the worshiping community and those who are outside of it. We've also compartmentalized, and I know we'll recognize this in our lives, where, and the very best saying that captures this is that I'm spiritual but not religious. So we've moved our notions of spirituality outside of the gathered community, the practicing community. And of course, we know there are all kinds of reasons for that. So another form of compartmentalization. A lack of meaning and relevance. And I think one of the people who has helped us the most to understand this is Reginald Bibby, because Reginald Bibby is a sociologist in Canada. He just recently retired. I have to say, I had real tears when I heard he was retiring because of the value of his work over the years. But he's been able to help us see for the last 50 years that, and again, this goes to that other aspect of compartmentalization, that the fact that people are not coming to gather with the worshiping community on Sundays or whenever it's gathering does not mean they don't believe in God or that they're not spiritual. And he's been able to hold that up for us. So we can't in a way hide behind the idea of, oh, well, they don't really want to be here. They're not really looking for that meaning making and that discipleship. And he was able to discover that many people who continued to identify as Catholic, for example, other denominations as well, but certainly Catholic among them, were saying very openly in the studies that they would gladly consider returning to the Sunday community or the regular meeting of the Christian community if they were finding meaning and relevance when they went. And so there's something there that needs our attention. So for many, there's a lack of meaning and relevance. And this is one of the most important things for us to look at when we ask, how can we engage in effective practice in our educating, in our learning and growing spaces, whatever umbrella those are under. A loss of trust. We probably don't need to go very far to unpack that. And I think that's only gotten more intense, certainly in the Canadian church over this last year with the shocking discovery of the graves of those children. And yet, I mean, thankfully, it is also continuing to open a hopeful, potentially hopeful path towards reconciliation. But there has been so much loss of trust on so many fronts that the disillusionment that comes with that, we know, has caused many people to distance themselves from the community, from the Christian community. And then marginalization. There are so many groups that are pushed outside, not accepted, don't feel welcomed or invited. And again, this is a huge element aspect of the faith life gap. Now, we discovered too in this last phase 2, and moving into phase 3, which we've just ended, that one of the reasons, and we were grateful that there were good things that came from the pandemic, because we were able to clearly see some things that might not have been so highlighted because of the context of a pandemic. And one of the things we saw was that as soon as we started to move into lockdown, one of the first set of offices to get closed in the church were catechetical offices, adult faith education, and other related offices. And we, as a focus group, we ourselves were saying, well, maybe we should just kind of, pull back and let things pass before we continue our work. Now, of course, that was in the days where we all thought maybe we were going to be in lockdown for a month or so, right? So we ourselves were saying maybe that's the thing to do, just to step back and wait. And one of our focus group members said, wait a minute. If we're not ready to meet people where they are in a time of crisis, when is the right time to be ready to meet people where they are? And we realized right away that and we were so grateful to her for so clearly articulating that for our team. And we realized right away that we were probably ourselves working out of an assumption which does undermine, which does contribute to that faith life disconnect, where we don't always see our adult faith education, our catechesis, as an activity, a ministry, an action of the Christian community that is intended to accompany people in their faith life at all times, and perhaps mostly in times of crises or in times of need. So we can see how there's a shift in perspective that very intentionally needs to take place there. So our sense of what the faith life gap or divide, disconnect is all about is continuing to grow. And we think we're gaining some meaningful insight that we need to continue to share with the community so it can help us in our responses. We have 2 resources that have come up out of our research so far. The first one was called 5 Promising Practices and Other Practical Wisdom, a resource for all who accompany faith. That was in phase 1. And then phase 2, we ended up completing the majority of our work together during the pandemic. So we decided to call our resource Where Faith and Life Meet While We're 2 Meters Apart, Wisdom from Accompanying Adult Faith During a Global Pandemic. And we really wanted to acknowledge the importance of that context in helping the insights to come to the surface that were able to come to the surface in that time. So we have several kind of bodies of findings to share with you, in addition to, I think, what is growing awareness about the faith life gap. But in phase 1, we were able to discover what we thought we'd call 5 promising practices. And I want to name them here because everything that comes after really builds on this foundation. So, and they were very important. The first thing that came to the surface in phase 1 was this ethical responsibility of the church to provide competent frameworks and leadership for adult faith education. I don't know where you are, but where I am, often faith education for adults, faith development for adults is treated as a kind of optional activity. And there are fewer and fewer offices or leaders whose sole responsibility it is to hold that particular ministry. So the ethical responsibility, again, going back to the twofold nature of what it means to grow in faith, the ethical responsibility to help us become adult believers is really essential if the church's mission is to be engaged. And if we're to respect that beloved person that each and every person is, who needs to do that meaning making, that universal hunger to have that quenched, that hunger responded to in their lives. We discovered that adult faith education is for human freedom and agency. We were really trying to get away from the idea that we do something to people, and to see that God is already active and alive in the life of every person long before they ever darken our doorway or we meet them on the path. We realize that adult faith education, and again, this alludes to what I was sharing with you from Fowler's work, that it must hold together mind, body, spirit, and will. In other words, the whole person, that faith development and human development are inextricably connected, and that adult faith educators are transformative lead learners, able to design and hold spaces where adults can make this meaning and mature as Christian disciples. We also, and again, it's just an echo of what we've already said, we were able to articulate a process spiral for adult catechesis, adult faith education, that we've been continuing to test and offering to practitioners in the field. A lot of people say, I know I need to do more process to really meet people where they are, but I'm not sure how to go about that. And we discovered that this spiral is a very good way of facilitating that. No matter what we're talking about, no matter what the content is, moving through this spiral, as I alluded to earlier, allows us to engage in that kind of process that we know facilitates learning and growing and meaning making in adults. In the second phase, we were able to articulate what we're calling 11 points of wisdom, and we can see how many of them flesh out and elaborate what we discovered in the 5 promising practices. A lot of good challenges there, and a lot of good insights there. And we discovered that the first one is probably the most fundamental, and it's quite related to the ethical responsibility that we're trying to underscore, that effective adult faith education maintains that profound coherence between faith and life and helps to bridge the gaps when they occur by being intentionally present to accompany adults in all the experiences of their lives, and especially in times of crisis or times of need. We were also, as I mentioned earlier, discovering the importance of community of practice, the need to kind of unmask our assumptions that might be limiting how we understand and engage in this work. We were discovering that the generative listening and speaking that was our method is actually the method for the kind of education we're looking for. Yes, anyway, I won't go through each and every one of them, and I'll make my PowerPoint presentation available after. But as I say, what I think is most important is how they were really putting flesh on the bones of what we were discovering in phase 1. So now with phase 3, again, we're going forward on this, what we find now quite a rich foundation. And one of the clearest statements that we were able to make coming into this phase is, again, that adult faith education is meeting people where they are. It is accompaniment. It is profoundly relational rather than about transmitting ideas to somebody. And we need to make the shifts in perspective and practice to help us become more effective in doing this. And more and more, we're discovering insights into how to do that. And I just want to mention to you as well that, thank you. Just want to mention to you as well, we were very intentional in coming into phase 3, especially we were beginning last September when, you know, the shocking discovery of those graves was in front of our eyes. And also, we were noticing the challenges that are becoming more and more intense with the many newcomers who are coming to dwell among us to be parts of our community. And we realized going into phase 3 that we couldn't, in good conscience, engage in research without intentionally including those voices. And so we did at every step of this phase that is just winding down, include the voices of both newcomers, people working with newcomers, and Indigenous. Now, I want to be very careful in how I frame this because it was an extremely modest effort when we think of the magnitude of what needs to be addressed. It was very modest, but we knew we needed to hear those voices. And among the most helpful things that came about from that intentional inclusion was how underscored listening became as the key to making progress. And, you know, that has been so much the characteristic of the movement forward with Indigenous peoples in reconciliation, is listening to the stories. And we're realizing that voice was able to bring to all of us the keen awareness of our need to become better listeners. And better. And one thing that was brought, it was Sister Priscilla Solomon who said, not only listening, but making sure that the person knows they've been heard. And so this is a wonderful, I think, rich practice that will continue to empower and expand what we're doing. There are many other findings as well that I'm eager to share with you. The voices of newcomers and those who are working with newcomers were really able to challenge us and say, you know, we need to be operating in all aspects of our learning and growing as church, operating out of a better theology of inclusion and diversity, you know, that really sees that the margins of the church should never be the poor or compromised. They are the center of the church. Our theology needs to reflect that. The poor, the marginalized, the new among us in society, they should be at the center of the church, just as Jesus demonstrates for us. And so that was a very powerful message to continually come to the surface as a result of hearing these important voices of Indigenous, of newcomers, and those working closely in those contexts. So we are continuing to unpack the implications of that for our practice. And a theology of inclusion that regards diversity as a gift, not a problem. Even though it presents all kinds of practical problems. One of the bishops who was in our focus, in our semi-structured interview, says, we have so many cultures and so many languages in front of us now that I just don't know what to do with that. And I think he's expressing the challenge that many are feeling. But it was so interesting to hear one of our focus group members who works very closely with, and she herself is a newcomer and works closely with the newcomers in her diocese, talk about how she and her bishop went to meet with a group. And they intentionally said, let's go not to speak, let's go to listen. And when they made that shift, she said, it seems like a subtle shift, but all of a sudden, we were engaged in an entirely different kind of conversation with the people who gathered, where we were inviting them to consider with their own wisdom as a community, how they could move forward in addressing and welcoming diversity as a gift instead of a problem, and making some progress to really honor that diverse nature of their community. And all of a sudden, there was wisdom coming to the surface, which would not have come to the surface had they been the only ones to have something to say in the gathering. So these learnings are key for us, and we continue to grapple with what they mean for practice. And I'm now right in the throes of writing the third resource with my co-researcher, who many of you would know, Lorraine St. Marie. And Lorraine and I are right in the throes of writing this research, of really mining and articulating the findings that have come to the surface in phase 3. So stay tuned. I'll be eager to share all of that with you as it becomes clearer in our writing, our time of writing and analysis. Again, we're feeling right now very affirmed by the synodal call, and so many of the themes align. So we're we're receiving that as a sign of the Spirit's presence among us in what we're doing, and we're eager to be a place of empowerment for that synodal church that Francis is inviting us to. And we keep coming back to this story, and it's going to be part of our phase 3 findings, the road to Emmaus, because when we think about the process, that transformative educational process, the transformative learning and growing spaces that help us to connect faith and life, meet people where they are, to satisfy that deep hunger we have for meaning. And again, we see Jesus coming alongside these two strangers, as they're called in the text, in a time of great crises in their life. And notice the first thing he does is walk with and listen, which again, we think is modeling so well the kind of practice we need to refine to become stronger in ourselves, in our faith education, our adult catechesis. And we notice in the whole journey along the road, how he listens carefully. He's really with them. He allows them to express their despair. And then he engages them in some kind of wonderful, generative, interactive period where he, beginning with the prophets, he helps unpack for them their own story of faith, their history of faith in such a way. We don't get a lot of detail in that part of the passage, which is so disappointing. It would be wonderful to hear more about how exactly he did that. But we know that it brings them to a place of wonderful, life-changing new insight about how the Messiah could die. The Messiah could die and rise again, and that changed everything, such that when they reach Emmaus, they don't want the stranger to leave them. They invite him, and notice it's they who invite him to stay and eat and to be with them. Anyway, that's an abbreviated form, but if we walk slowly and carefully through that whole encounter, we see, I think, in very helpful stages and terms, the kind of process that we need to be about in order to bridge the gap between faith and life, in order for faith and life to really be integrated in each and every one of us. So I'm sorry, I apologize. I've talked an awful lot. I wonder if we could take at least, let's say 8 minutes in a group. And I'm just wondering, let's take a little bit of time in your groups. What are you hearing that has resonance with your experience and insight? And what concrete response might you suggest in your community of faith in terms of bridging the faith life gap in how we create our learning and growing spaces? So what are you hearing that has resonance for you with your insight and experience? You might want to just jot this down, although we can also put it up in your discussion groups, but I'd much rather you saw each other and could talk to one another. And what concrete response might you suggest in your community of faith? Now I have a challenge. I have a challenge for us. I wonder if we could just hear from one person from each of the 7 groups. And if you'd be so kind, here's the challenge. Could you think of one sentence that, I mean, obviously we won't be hearing exhaustive reports as much as maybe we would like of what was discussed, but could you choose one sentence that expresses something important that was discussed in your group? Just to give us, just so we can all have a taste, only a taste of what's been discussed among you. So let's, could you, one sentence that describes where people were finding resonance with what they're hearing, and maybe a concrete action that was suggested for communities. So Davina, you would like to speak for your group, please. Davina.
Hello. Hi, Carol. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too. One sentence now.
Yes, one sentence. Okay, I'll make a very long sentence then. So
lots of commas.
Lots of commas. everyone liked the idea that we're going from where people are.
Good,
And that was very important.
good.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's
Another group, just one sentence that tells us something important that was shared among you. We know it's just a reflection, just a
Yeah.
take. Yes, Carmel, please.
I would say from our group, it was certainly many people come to church, but they don't really get involved. They don't know anyone, and no one is welcoming them either. It works
Good.
both ways.
Thank you, Carmel. So
Mhm.
important for us to understand that.
Mhm.
Another group, one sentence, something important that was shared among you.
I could say something from our group.
Yes, please, Christine.
I think the majority, I think this would be fair, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but that today's faith education that people are experiencing in the parishes is speaking more to heads than to actual life. And people are really dissatisfied.
Mhm.
And when they speak to their pastor, he may seem like he's listening, but it never impacts what's happening.
Okay, thank you. That's important to share here in our community of practice. Thank you. Another insight from another group. One thing that was shared among you. Elizabeth, please.
The group I was in, we all felt that we had heard these things before. There wasn't really a lot new. The importance of welcoming and listening and moving forward together. But we were really pleased about the synod and the fact that it's brought this
Yes.
whole thing to light for everyone that has taken part in it. And we're anxious to find out how to fill that, to bridge those gaps that exist.
Straight.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Anyone else? One insight. Yes, please, Lise, from your group.
Yes, from our group, what stayed with me is that the church has to be more than just attending rituals.
Yeah.
It's just got to be more than that. And
Mhm.
it's missing
Good. Thank you.
in a lot
Lise.
of places.
Thank you. So important. Have we heard from all of the groups? I think there would be.
No, I
two
could
more.
speak for our group.
Please,
um,
Rosemary.
We didn't have an integrated conversation. It was more each person speaking on their own. We endorse, though, the real disconnect between what happens inside a church and what happens when we go home.
Mhm.
We just leave it there, and the messages are not necessarily carried into everyday life. There was a question about maturing. And I think we said maturing as a person, as an adult, on a personal level, doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will be a person of faith. You may go hand in hand, but one doesn't guarantee the other. However, to have a faith maturity, I think you were telling us that you have to have personal maturity as well.
Right.
There is a suggestion that in the future, church will have to be based perhaps more on community, and that would be more in keeping with what the synod is trying to inculcate.
Good.
And the fourth thing was that if we're going to try to do transformative, be leaders in transformative learning, then we have to have an understanding of what it is to have a transformative experience ourselves. And it would be beneficial for us to focus on that, reflect on that in our own life.
Thank you. Very meaningful. Thank you, Rosemary. Is there one more group we haven't heard from? And can I invite just that one meaningful sentence that would give us a take
Okay.
of your conversation? Liz, please.
I can speak for our group, I guess. Mostly, I would say that we focused on listening and how empowering listening is and how transformative it can be. And also that it can take a long time.
Yes.
Yes.
It's
That
hard
needs
work
to,
to build those relationships.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I'm so grateful for your engagement. I'm sorry we didn't have time for longer, more in-depth conversations, but certainly appreciate what you have shared in your groups.
Thank you.
So Thank you very much, Dr. Carroll. And I now ask Father Winkler, who will be giving his note of thanks, as we always do after one of these sessions. Thank you very, very much. I saw a lot of note taking going on during this session, let me tell you.
Yes, I really enjoyed this session a lot. There's a number of insights that Carol spoke about coming out of her research that I think is important for all of us to kind of be aware of, or I don't know. I felt it was very encouraging. The first thing that I got right away was this idea of faith maturity, being mature in the faith. What does it mean? And she's using here Fowler's work, and that when we reach a mature faith, we get beyond the arguing, the polarizing. And I think it indicates where someone is in some ways about where we are in our own faith. So that's someplace that I'd like to grow and be more transformed. Secondly, it's not about adult faith formation isn't about teaching ideas as much as it is relations with one another and accompaniment. It's not about an intellectual grasping of ideas and doctrines and things like that. It's more about encouraging the whole person, spirit, body, mind, emotions, will. All of these things is a holistic, integrated approach to catechesis. Thirdly, she gave us some notions of where the gap originated. And she mentioned that the Vatican Council mentioned things that happened from the outside of the church, like the movements of atheism and secularism and individualism. But also we begin to look inside our church, and some of the reasons why the gap is especially becoming more and more wide, reasons of compartmentalization, loss of trust in the church, the feeling of being marginal. These are all contributing to the gap. So this is a work for us as faith communities. And finally, I'm just going to say that what Carol talks about is a process. It's not like a canned program. I can't go to a bookstore and buy a book on how to renew the parish. None of us can, or how to renew the church, as if there was first you do this A, B, C, D. That's a canned program. And but it's a process that we're looking for. It's not it's a movement that takes place. It's something where we don't have it's a movement where we have surprising results. And sometimes it's hard to get beyond the idea of a program and the idea of a process. So I want to thank Carol for this. I've really enjoyed this afternoon immensely. And I want to thank Carol for being available to us, to helping us understand something about the signs of our times, the reality of the gap that exists, and methods and hope for closing the gap. So thank you. Now, I have a niece. She's Indigenous. And she has been learning her culture, that's what she says, through beading. She does beading. And I'm thankful because she beads a little gift for every one of our speakers who speak with us in the sign conversation for our times. And I don't know if you can see this object. Can you see it?
Yes.
It's a pin. It's a tulip. She made a very similar one for Sister Eva Solomon when she was here, but this is a new one she's done, and it's a tulip. And because Carol's work takes place in Ottawa, she thought it would be a good idea to give her a beaded tulip. And so that was our gift for her. Now, the last thing that I want to say before we end our time together is that our next Conversations for Our Time features an Anglican priest. Her name is Mother Maggie. She's a pastor of a parish in the very downtown core of Toronto, very urban environment. In fact, you can't get more urban than where she is. It's impossible in Canada, right in the city of Toronto. And she's going to discuss issues of homelessness that she's encountered within her parish and that affect her parish. That takes place on, it's in November. And maybe Rosemary can remind me of the exact date.
November 20th.
November the 20th. That's right. November the 20th is our next one with Mother Maggie of Toronto. So please, thank you for joining us today. I learned a lot. I learn a lot from all of these times that we spend.
Can I jump in here also to say, for those who asked, I'm just sending a note.
Oops, you're muted.
There, I'm not muted anymore. If I could just jump in, I'm just sending a note again to everybody. We've been given the opportunity to share the details of the PowerPoint that was used today. So to simplify matters, please drop an email to stbasils@gmail.com. It's in the chat line. Just use that email, and when we receive the PowerPoint, our mighty office staff at St. Basil's will send it to you in return. That's the easiest way of doing this. So thank you. And sorry, I cut you off in your final words there, Father.
No, those were my final words. We have 2 minutes to spare. I'm going to leave them with Carol Kuzmochka.
Oh, thank you, Daryl, because you know what I would love. First of all, thank you so much. I will treasure my beaded brooch. That is such a privilege. And I'll find a way to say thank you to your niece. Thank you all for your engagement. I often like, if you won't mind, if you'd be gracious, just as a way of ending, to invite us all to unmute. This might be a little bit messy, but most of us are good at dealing with messes. And just to call out words and phrases that describe how you are leaving here today. Words and phrases.
Listening.
Confirmed.
Hopeful.
Reassured.
Encouraged.
Appreciation.
Spiritual maturity.
More knowledgeable.
Affirmed.
Community.
Affirmed.
Hopeful.
Renewed.
Challenged.
Comforted.
Diversity is a gift, not a problem.
I was.
To Carol, Father Des O'Connor would have been very proud of you today.
Oh, Anne, right. Thank you.
Encouraged.
Just a realization that we're looking not for a program, but a process that will lead us toward a ministry of adult faith focused on accompaniment and a relationship. When somebody brought that,
So grateful.
And now we have a good taste of how we're leaving here.
Okay.